Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Oh, that was good. Nice response. Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for joining us, both here in person and for those who will be joining us via the live stream. My name is Daniel Horan. I'm a Franciscan friar and professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the absolute distinct privilege of serving as the director of the Center for Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. And on behalf of the Center, I am delighted to welcome you to the 2023 Madeleva Lecture. First, a word about the Center for Spirituality. Founded in 1984, with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, many of whom are with us this evening, both in person and virtually, and with the vision of Dr. Keith Egan, the founding director, who is also with us here with his spouse Connie Egan, and we acknowledge their presence here. The Center for Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, the Center draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before we proceed with our exciting event this evening, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land and to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of the Potawatomi and the Miami peoples, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our indigenous siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. It is now my pleasure to welcome to the podium Dr. Katie Comboy, President of St. Mary's College, to offer some opening remarks on behalf of St. Mary's.
Thank you, Father Dan. My role here tonight is just so small because all I want to do is welcome all of you to St. Mary's College and to acknowledge that the Madeleva Lecture is truly one of the most prestigious events that happens on our campus each year, although it hasn't happened every year for the last couple of years. COVID had its role in that. Tonight, though, we are delighted to welcome our very prestigious speaker, Dr. Cristina Traina. I'm not introducing Dr. Traina, but I do want to say this evening is one of the finest examples of the intellectual vitality that exists on this campus. St. Mary's has always been known since the time of our legendary president, Sister Madeleva Wolff, for bringing speakers to campus who are at the highest level of their professions. And the Madeleva Lecture continues this tradition, honoring a distinguished female theologian annually to accentuate the vibrant voice of women in theology. So I am here really tonight just to thank you for your presence. I hope you enjoy Dr. Traina's lecture, and I also hope you leave inspired by the creative and intellectual energy that exists on this campus. And Father Dan Horan will now introduce our speaker.
Thank you, President Comboy. This lecture is named after the late Sister Madeleva Wolff, who was a poet, a scholar, an educator, a higher education administrator, and sister of the Holy Cross. When Sister Madeleva was president of St. Mary's College, she established the groundbreaking School of Sacred Theology program, which was the first Catholic graduate program of its kind to admit women to study for master's and doctoral degrees in theology. The school thrived from 1943 until 1970. This annual lecture honors distinguished women theologians and scholars of religion. In partnership with Paulus Press, the annual Madeleva Lecture is then published as a small book, which makes it accessible to a much larger audience. It's now my honor to introduce this year's Madeleva Lecturer. Professor Cristina Traina is the Cardinal Avery Dulles Chair in Catholic Theology at Fordham University in New York. Before moving to Fordham, Professor Traina was a faculty member and former chair of the Religious Studies Department at Northwestern University in Illinois, where she taught for nearly 30 years. Professor Traina earned her undergraduate degree at Princeton University with a concentration in the study of religion. She then earned her MA and PhD at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Professor Traina is one of the leading Catholic ethicists in the United States. Her research focuses on critical and constructive feminist ethics, and her special areas of expertise include sexuality, ethics of relationship, methodological questions, and moral agency, including the moral agency of children. The theme of the moral agency of children is the focus of her current major research project. She has also worked and taught in the areas of bioethics, migration, intersectionality, and economic and political justice. She is the author of 2 books, Feminist Ethics and Natural Law, The End of the Anathemas, published in 1999 by Georgetown University Press, and Erotic Attunement, Parenthood and the Ethics of Sensuality Between Unequals, published in 2011 by the University of Chicago Press. Additionally, she is the author of dozens of articles, book chapters, and reviews, and has served on editorial boards at several journals. She is an active member of many learned societies, having served in several leadership capacities, including as a former board member and president of the Society of Christian Ethics. In addition to the impressive scholarly accomplishments Professor Traina has achieved, she has also contributed to the church and society in remarkable ways. She serves on the advisory board for New Ways Ministry and has been active in LGBTQ ministries at various parishes. She has also collaborated with other community members when living in Evanston, Illinois, to convert the community's ESL programs for Spanish speakers into 2 immersion programs, which promotes community among children and families whose first language was English and children and families whose first language was Spanish, thereby improving Spanish speakers' access to the curriculum by ending pull-out instruction in the classroom. Tonight, Professor Traina will deliver the 2023 Madeleva Lecture titled Feminism, Finitude, and Flourishing, on being mortal like everyone else. Please join me in extending a warm St. Mary's College welcome to Professor Traina.
Thanks so much, Professor Haran, and everyone for being here and for entrusting me with the awe-inspiring responsibility of continuing the Madeleva tradition. It's quite an honor for me. I also am glad to be back in Indiana. I don't know if any of you know that I was raised as a Hoosier, just a little south of here in Crawfordsville. So it's nice to be back in my old stomping grounds, and also have spent a wonderful semester a few years ago at Notre Dame in the Department of Gender Studies. And one of my great joys during that time was coming over to St. Mary's for liturgies and other events, which really was something that fed my spirit when I was here. So thank you for inviting me back to St. Mary's. Well, we have all seen COVID-era photos of middle-class women struggling and juggling children or elders or both, household, work, community responsibilities. We've also seen images of working-class women navigating all of that, plus public transportation and the hoops through which they have to jump to unlock health care, affordable housing and child care, and other essentials. At all income levels, they look isolated, tired, distracted, and stressed out. In other words, they are not flourishing. Spoiler alert, we're not going to solve all their problems in this lecture. But we've also seen the solutions that our commercial culture suggests. Self-help books to help women prioritize and execute their tasks more efficiently. Meditation and yoga classes, aromatherapy, exercise, anxiety medication, massages, and spa days. All products that middle and upper class women can purchase to feel better without taking anything off their to-do lists. And if they're working class, they're told that sacrifice, self-discipline, good humor, patience, and remembering that Jesus is with them at every hour of the day don't cost any time or money. I am not knocking any of these hacks. I've used some. There are just two problems with them. First, not everyone can afford the commercial ones, so the richest women get the most relief. Second, both kinds of solutions imply that the problem lies with the woman, not the workload. If she were just more strategic, more patient, more energetic, calmer, and stronger, she'd be able to handle it all by herself with one hand tied behind her back. In other words, if she were Superwoman. The many strands of U.S. feminism agree on this. The problem is not that people who identify as women are refusing to be superwomen. Low pay, the double shift, impossibly costly housing and childcare, and sexual harassment are not in their control. Social, economic, and political structures are stacked against them. The solution is not spa days and planners, it's social change. Especially in the 1970s and 80s, white U.S. feminist theologians agreed that if we could establish gender justice, women's compressed, distressed spirits, and men's too, would expand to their full potential, channeling divine love. Book titles and cover art celebrated the power of women's loving goddess energy unleashed. This is for you old-timers. To be sure, it was and is high time that society and the church nurtured, welcomed, and rewarded women and men equally. People who identify as women needed and still need to hear and repeat, I am a child of God, filled with the power of the Holy Spirit. Without doubt, we must fight for gender justice, intersectionally, undoing not just structural sexism, but also all the other interlocking isms that keep women down, like racism, ableism, and anti-immigrant policies and biases. Yet I think we feminists have too infrequently asked, what would flourishing in a just society look like? We would still not be superheroes. We would still be finite. Even in a perfectly just world, we would undergo physical and mental illness, injury, natural disasters, and of course, birth, childhood, aging, and death. We are, as the Book of Wisdom says, mortal, like everybody else. And our finitude is not a fault, not a shortcoming, not a failure of dedication or perseverance. It is something that happens within the envelope of our mortality. It is the divinely intended good condition of our creatureliness. What does it mean to put finitude at the center of feminist theologies and ethics rather than just assuming it or addressing it as an afterthought? I thank you for your patience in listening to me experiment with this. I want to make the case that it helps us to refine our idea of what it means to live well, while reinforcing our call for justice. And while it does not solve knotty moral problems, it gives them a kind of nuance, texture, and specificity that might help us cross ideological divides. I'll do this in 4 stages. First, I'll briefly harvest some key points from liberationist feminist theologies, and then I'll explore feminist theologies of vulnerability, care, and disability to discern how flourishing under finitude might look in their eyes. Third, I'll tie these observations to 2 central theological doctrines, incarnation and Trinity. Finally, I'll step back a bit to ask, what difference might flourishing within finitude make for a couple of pressing moral issues? My attempt to do this will be finite too. So right now, my thanks to the many wise people on whom I'm depending, who would more than fill this platform, very few of whom I will be able to mention by name. So, as I mentioned before, late 20th century liberation theologies argue that sin, especially greed and self-aggrandizement, takes on a life of its own in institutions and systems, causing political, economic, and cultural injustice that leads to widespread suffering. Christ's victory over sin does not remove these unjust structures, but it empowers us to undo as much worldly oppression as possible in anticipation of heaven coming to earth, when sin will be fully vanquished. And to lever the grace of Christ's victory in the resurrection, and to break down sinful structures, we need more than theology. We need to understand how these powerful structures function. We need to look under the hood, so to speak. Who better to do this than people they harm most, who see firsthand how they work? In addition, we must advocate first for the welfare of the most oppressed. In liberationist feminism, women, in particular women of color, provide us with the first clues to an ethic of finitude. And I am about to ignore a lot and paint with a very wide brush, okay? So, first, in the 1970s and 80s, U.S. white feminist theologians drew on women's experience to describe oppressive patriarchal systems and dislodge them, and to honor the power of the divine in women. Rosemary Radford Ruether is just one example, and among other things, she celebrated the sacred gift of the female body, re-envisioned God as God-des with a slash in the middle, and reimagined spirituality, sacrament, and theology from women's perspective. She and other white feminists took an essential step toward a theology of finitude by agreeing that we are our bodies, and our bodies are ourselves. They are not just containers for our minds and spirits. Womanist theologians work at the intersection of the double oppressions of racism and misogyny. Their experience of racism among supposedly liberationist white feminists and misogyny among supposedly liberationist black men have made them more realistic about the complexity and tenacity of oppression, and therefore about the speed with which liberation can occur. Katie Geneva Cannon spoke of, quote, hitting a straight lick with a crooked stick, creatively wielding a theology still distorted by racism and sexism to undermine those very injustices. Emily Towns reappropriates Sapphire, an image of headstrong, truth-telling, no-nonsense sass, quote, rooted in anti-female and anti-black ideology and imagination. Whites and all men, Towns says, see the stereotypical Sapphire as dangerous because she's strong and independent, not devoted to whites and unable to be controlled by men. Under oppression, especially, these are virtues, not vices. Towns turns the slur inside out and upside down to create a tool for identifying and resisting anti-blackness and misogyny creatively while living under it. Mujerista and Latina feminist theologians, too, work to establish justice at a multi-point intersection of oppression, race, gender, and often language and immigration status. Ada Maria Sassi Diaz argued that structures of oppression reveal themselves most clearly in Latina women's struggle, la lucha, amid the challenges of the basic everyday tasks, lo cotidiano, needed to keep themselves and their families going amid scarcity, unpredictability, and injustice. The person is the structural. It's in shopping for dinner that we're confronted with the higher cost of food in underserved neighborhoods. It's in signing a lease that we come face to face with a shortage of affordable housing. It's in leaving for work earlier and returning home later that we're faced with the unjust consequences of targeted cuts to public transit schedules. Like white feminist and womanist liberationists, mujerista and Latina feminist theologians engage lo cotidiano as the first step in diagnosing and battling oppression. Otherwise, as Nancy Pineda Madrid says, what's the point of theorizing? Amen to that. Still, the everyday concerns us tonight also because it would remain essential to human life even in a perfectly just world. About this, these liberation feminists have taught us that we are embodied, Our embodied selves have everyday needs, both individually and in community, and our constraints harbor possibilities for creativity. Theologically, we can say these are elements of our good, finite creation. So far, so good. 3 other strands of ethics that I want to explore tonight round out the answer even more. If liberationists remind us that the time-consuming practice of caring for children and the elderly and people with disabilities is crucial, yet unjustly rewarded, theologians of care like Sandra Sullivan Dunbar also point to essential qualities of our humanity that emerge in the course of caretaking. For now, I want to stress just 2 of her points. First, care involves a relationship between the carer and the cared for that must respect the dignity of each. That dignity cannot be rooted in rationality or agency or any other non-universal human quality, John Locke aside. Instead, it rests in our quote-unquote primordial creaturely dependence upon God. We would not exist at all without God's creation and God's continuous care and sustenance. Second, we're dependent on each other as well. During infancy, childhood, illness, injury, dementia, disability, and decline, not just for short periods of our life, we need others' intensive, personalized care to thrive. Dependency is part of our created finitude. Others' care is crucial to our flourishing, and our care is essential to theirs. Hilla Hocker begins with our vulnerability, our susceptibility to be affected by incidents and or conditions beyond our control, as she says. Vulnerability is part of our good, created, basic openness to the world, which shapes us as humans in relations with other beings. Vulnerability shapes us all the way down. As physical beings affected by nurture, attack, or neglect, as moral beings susceptible to respect, affirmation, and engagement, but also to dismissal, domination, and misrecognition, and as members of complex social systems positioned at structural nexuses that either jeopardize us, both physically and existentially, or unfairly advantage us. One consequence is that our social character is not a second thought or an unfortunate need or a contract we enter into for convenience or something we do for fun. We are social essentially. We are persons only amid other relations that shape us and through which we shape them. In addition, we are inspirited and embodied in this physical setting, these relationships, these structures. To flourish is to be entwined in particular relations and structures that honor our physical and moral integrity. Maybe these aren't earth-shattering aspects of finitude and flourishing. You probably could have written them down if I'd given you a 5-minute writing assignment. But feminist disability theologians take these claims to logical conclusions that may be a little less comfortable. And for this reason, I want to spend a bit more time on them. Deborah Creamer argues that liberationist feminist ethics can be ableist when it implies that true flourishing returns us to a state of divinely intended natural beauty and mental, spiritual, and bodily perfection, erasing disabilities, wounds, and illnesses, and maybe even pimples or wrinkles or muffin tops. Sorry, I could not resist this. I saw it in the New Yorker this week, or gray hair. What might it mean to flourish in one's accustomed body? Much as Sandra Sullivan Dunbar says of needing care, feminist disability theologians argue that we actually spend much or most of our lives outside the range of normal abilities, quote unquote, right? In addition, ability and disability are queer categories, expanding and contracting according to whatever a culture considers normal or ideal at the moment. Is ADD a disability? or an alternative mode of productive functioning. It depends on what the dominant educational culture considers ideal behavior. Or think about how Western ideals of female beauty have changed and multiplied. Even non-disabled bodies, quote unquote, are neither ideal nor normal. They leak, they hurt, they break down and have to go to physical therapy. As Jana, I heard who laughed at that one. As Jana Bennett writes, we have been lying to ourselves about having normal bodies and minds. Creamer turns the tables. If we stop defining disability as a deficit from normality, we can focus on what all human beings share. The unsurprising universal experience of limits. Disability becomes simply an intrinsic, unsurprising, and valuable element of human limitness. This inversion of perspective, she says, calls us to examine the values and choices involved in our attitudes toward limits. That some of us have a limited ability to walk becomes less consequential if we realize none of us can fly. That some of us are blind becomes less consequential if we realize that 75% of adults need some form of vision correction. If we see these limits not as, quote, an array of unfortunate alternatives to omnipotence, but instead as, quote, good, or at the very least not evil, she says, we can then begin to move not only to a perspective where we embrace, value, accept, respect the idea of having limits as individuals and communities, but can also notice the ways in which these limits might embrace us, acting to make and unmake issues of identity, relationality, space, and place. Limits, she says, can contribute to human identity, culture, and community. To be sure, human limits that burden social participation still deserve social and physical support as a matter of justice. Creamer is not coming after my glasses, thank goodness. But her main point is theological. Limits, quote, must be seen as integral elements of our understandings of self and other, as key characteristics for reflection in a theological anthropology, not as evils to be eliminated. Limits are integral to human being, and our individual limits are integral to our individual beings. Womanists apply creativity and deadly serious whimsy within unjust, unchosen limits because their focus is liberation from oppression. Creamer adds to this that any sort of unchosen limit is an invitation to creativity, to developing transcending practices of flourishing within its bounds, even if it doesn't carry the added burden of overthrowing injustice. This doesn't mean that we can wave the troublesome consequences of finitude away simply by providing all the social supports needed to live well within its bounds. As disability theologian Nancy Iceland wrote almost 3 decades ago, and it's worth quoting her at length, I think, embodiment is not a purely agreeable reality. It incorporates profound ambiguity, sometimes downright distress. There is simply no denying it. We concede the precarious position of living a difficult life and affirming our bodies as whole, good, and beautiful. In this incongruity, the revolutionary act of accepting our bodies as survivable, not deficient or deformed, is vital. Instead of flagellating ourselves or aspiring to well-behaved, perfect bodies, we savor the jumbled pleasure-pain that is our bodies. In a society where denial of our particular bodies and questing for a better body is normal, respect for our own bodies is an act of resistance and liberation. With these both ands, Iceland takes us to the heart of our tradition, to theology of the incarnation. But before we go there, a reprise. Our good finite creation involves embodiment with all of its particularity, limits including mortality, and limited supplies of energy and waking hours, Exams are coming up, I realize. And the dailiness of ordinary needs. On every level, from practical physicality through the emotional and intellectual to the spiritual, we are essentially vulnerable to shaping by others and dependent on them to keep us in being. Even in a perfectly just world, this finitude would be the basis of a survivable life, filled with joy and grief, hope and despair, physical pleasure and ease, as well as physical pain and struggle that bring with them possibilities for creativity and transcendence. Flourishing in finitude is the life we live within these limits by pressing against them on all sides with safety ropes held by others, like a climber making her way up a crevasse. These reflections resonate with central Christian doctrines. The doctrine of the Imago Dei, which says that we are created in God's image, the Incarnation, which says that God became fully human in Jesus Christ without loss of divinity, and the Trinity, which recognizes three persons in relation in one God. Christology first. If to be in the image of God is to be in the image of Jesus Christ, God incarnate, we might be tempted to make Jesus, as the ad says, just a guy who gets us. The incarnation should probably not be reduced to that, but still Christology, who God is, incarnated in Jesus as the Christ, says something about who we are, and theological anthropology, who we are as persons in relation to God, says something about the boundaries God observes in order to appear and live and die and be reborn in human flesh. There are many rich angles on theological anthropology, and I recommend to you especially Susan Ross's and Dan Horan's. But tonight I want to invite us to think just about what the interchange between Christology and theological anthropology might tell us about imaging God from the perspective of finitude and flourishing. 4 implications. First, as Nancy Eisland points out, the second most remarkable thing about Jesus' resurrection, other than the fact that it occurred at all, is that he rises with his wounds. Wounds that confirm his identity, wounds so large that Thomas can probe them with his fingers. If Jesus was incarnate in human flesh and rose wounded, and we are created and rise in his image, perhaps even the perfection of our resurrected bodies will reflect the particular wounds of our finite lives. We need to redefine perfection to include every kind of embodied self, not just physiques that fulfill cultural aesthetic ideals. I'll come back to that in a bit. Second, the person Jesus was a unique individual as we are. Eating, drinking, laughing, shouting, weeping, and sleeping like any other finite person, he was unique in particular ways, and finite in particular ways. He was said to be male, not female or non-binary or trans. He was from Galilee. He spoke Aramaic. He was a person of color. He found crowds tiring, a real eye. And there are particulars we can't know about. Nearsightedness, sexual orientation, peanut allergy. Lisa Isherwood undoes our cultural Jesus art by musing that perhaps Jesus was fat. Her point is, if all of Jesus' finite human particulars can embody the divine, ours can too. Even if our particulars are different, like white skin or a different body shape or residence in North America or menstruation. The only prerequisites for imaging and embodying Christ are that, like Jesus, we are singular, finite humans, fully dependent on God, who lead our earthly lives in a relatively short span, in a particular place, time, and community, all of which we have very little control over. Full stop. Third, Jesus' divinity and humanity did not just coexist like roommates in the same body. We can speak of a divine nature and a human nature, but we cannot separate them. What does it mean to image Christ, then? Latina feminist theologian Mayra Rivera suggests the analogy spirit-flesh. Our spirit is intrinsic to our flesh, animating it across a distinction that is never a separation. If spirit flesh is, quote, the substance of our corporeality, our whole being is connected to and vulnerable to and limited by and active in our physical and social worlds, and our whole being is connected to the divine. Finite life in the wounded, limited, quirky spirit flesh, and not fantastical, superheroic existence, is the container for theosis, opening ever more to receiving and embodying divine love. Perfection can occur in any spirit-fleshed being. Finally, perhaps even more to the point, Jesus had limits in his earthly life. He did not heal all the sick. He did not preach to all the seeking. He did not comfort all the grieving. In fact, sometimes he refused to preach, right? And he did not teach all the ignorant. Nor can we, if we want to imitate Christ and Jesus. And there's the superwoman problem again. We need to give ourselves a break. Like Jesus, we cannot do everything. But stopping there would leave us with therapeutic individualism. The observation that we're finite and we can't do it all doesn't meet the legitimate needs of the people who will inevitably be left hurting if we don't try to do everything and help everyone. Even here, Jesus' particular finitude is a clue. Jesus, who relied on his companions for evangelism, groceries, lodging, rides across lakes, relaying messages, donkey rental, Passover preparation, and crowd control. This leads us to the second dimension of imaging God, the Trinity. Our exploration of feminist approaches to finitude has been shot through with interdependence. Mary Jo Iosio says that when we promote each other's flourishing in interdependent networks of love, we image the mutually loving persons of the Trinity. Iosio lists the myriad people and organizations who supported her mother as she cared for her father, who had dementia, activating her own network of interdependent relationships like, quote, daily mass, visits with her sisters, communion visits to parishioners unable to attend weekly services, kept her mother connected to community and raised her spirits. But she also needed regular practical help from institutional services like adult daycare, home health aides, from hospice, the Veterans Administration, the County Office on the Aging, and a private duty contract, unquote, not to mention respite hospice care. So both levels, the practical and the immediate practical and personal and the institutional. Trinitarian theology suggests another, even more essential way in which we image God in finitude. Trinitarian doctrine often feels mathematical, and I wouldn't blame you if you sort of fall asleep here. 3 persons and 1 God. None can exist without the other. Not only are they equal and interdependent among themselves, but they are also perichoretic, mutually participatory. Scratch the surface of one, and you will find the other 2. Within each, the others also dwell. We image the Trinity in this sense as well. Scratch our surface, and you will find all the people who dwell in us. For Hawker, because we are intrinsically social and open to others, the word person implies the individual with their social relations. We are partly the products of our relationships. Others reside at the core of our existence, and we dwell in theirs. So when one member of our circle starts to fade, as Iosio's father did as his dementia advanced, mutual indwelling keeps their personhood in being. Their caretakers' patience, fidelity, humor, and stories preserve their identities and their freedom. Dwelling in each other in love implies that we flourish in each other as well. Thus, we image the Trinity not just ethically when we mutually support each other in wide networks of love that imply the equal importance of each member, but also existentially. We are literally part of each other, and others are part of us. We owe it to each other to keep each other's identities, stories, and personalities going. We owe it to each other to honor not just the vulnerable selves that they are individually, but also the networks that make and support them. Conversely, harm to us not only reverberates through our network of practical interdependence, but it's an existential attack on all the members of our network. So cutting us off from our networks, for instance, if we're housebound or in prison or are forced to migrate to stay alive, this harms us not just by disrespecting our individual origin and end in God, which is bad enough, but by slicing away the others whom we need to flourish in our ordinary good created finitude, the others who are literally part of us, not to mention harming others by removing us from networks that rely on us. Paradoxically, to respect finitude is precisely to respect connection and interdependence as essential to our being, materially, emotionally, and spiritually. Imaging the Trinity is a group activity, by definition. As our sources have gradually revealed, we experience finite flourishing in 3 dimensions, and now I'm going to slice across the columns that I've been making and do something in the other direction. These 3 dimensions include, first, as human beings, we live complex, ambiguous, spirit-fleshed lifespans. We are interdependent in a practical sense, but also existentially. We indwell and form each other. That's been our main point so far. So those are the universal qualities. Second, as Dan Horan emphasizes, we are created as particular human beings, and our geographical, historical, and cultural settings interact with our specific gifts, our personality, our innate talents, and our limits, like mental and physical illness, disability, to magnify or constrain those gifts. For example, depending on where and when a person with musical talent is born, they might become Beethoven, or Samara Joy, or Jay-Z, or a church choir director, or none of those. These catalytic combinations produce our vocation, or our calling in our time and place, which is more than simply nurturing the seedlings of our own best selves. Sorry, I'm late on that one. How flourishing looks within the limits of these 2 dimensions of created finitude. All right, I'm sorry, I thought I was off. I think I'm back on track. The universal and the particular is too messy for TikTok and Instagram. For ordinary mortals, flourishing involves accepting our particular finitude and creating within the limits it provides. It entails sustaining hope, health, freedom, creativity, social connection, curiosity, and the capacity to care justly and lovingly for others and ourselves, amid ambiguity and incompleteness, joy and sorrow, pain and pleasure, wound and ability. Flourishing is a survivable life in which we have the interdependent relationships and institutional support to transform our limits from barriers to platforms for creativity and connection without removing them. To live well with infinitude also means that the picture frame is crowded. Others bear our lives with us and even indwell us with their strength, love, and virtue, and we bear their lives and indwell them. Our third experience of finitude is injustice, the attacks we inflict on each other on personal and systemic scales. The, quote, mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual forces that we apprehend as jeopardizing our very existence, as M. Sean Copeland says. As womanist, Latina, mujerista theologians have told us, flourishing amid these forces demands joining our voices in recognition, in rejection, in resistance, not acceptance. And it involves corporate lament of the unnecessary sinful wounds and limits they inflict, as well as creative collaboration to overthrow them and keep us going in hope. What does this get us for ethics? I think not a new set of answers, but the perspective gained from moving a few degrees around the circle. Tonight I want to think briefly about just a few of the ways in which flourishing and finitude might help us think through two current moral issues. What might flourishing with finitude imply for trans and intersex people? First, again, as Dan Horan mentioned earlier, God has created each of us in our unique particularity. Although this unique self is never a tidy package, our limits, contradictions, ambiguities, and incompletenesses are consequences of a good creation. Yet for trans and intersex people, the non-alignment of their physical, emotional, and spiritual identities becomes a barrier to creating networks of interdependency on which flourishing depends. And here is a reminder: when the aim is a survivable life, obstacles arising from our particularity and from injustice interact, and often they're indistinguishable in our experience. So to some degree, we can contribute trans and intersex people's obstacles to social participation to every culture's tendency to distinguish genders, even if those same cultures also embrace queerness and ambiguity and fluidity. But to some degree, to a large degree, we can attribute it to sinful intolerance that we must recognize, reject, resist, lament, and overcome. Yet whatever the source of their obstacles, trans and intersex people's finitude implies flourishing in this spirit flesh, in this lifetime, in this cultural understanding of gender and sexuality. Trans and intersex people, last I looked, were not immortal. They will not live forever. They deserve full social incorporation now. And to the degree that hormones and surgery can help, they must use them. Second, finitude implies limited knowledge, individually and corporately. We know only partially. As liberation theologians remind us, we know the forces that bear down on our lives better than anyone else. But we tend to have parallax when it comes to others' lives, especially if we don't share their particularities and their position in the social nexus. In ethics, we must exercise epistemological humility alongside the virtue of curiosity and a preferential option for the cared for. If we want to know what another person's particular finite flourishing requires here and now, we should ask. Anyone attempting to flourish or survive or inhabit their limits can tell you what they need. Stand by my good ear, or print my exam in 16-point font, or sit down to speak with me when I'm in my wheelchair, or no gluten, I have celiac disease. As members of their network of interdependence, we should be curious. We should ask. We should believe what they tell us, and we should respond as well as we can. This should be uncontroversial. Yet lawmakers in multiple states have acted to restrict participation and or care for trans people without asking them or their parents what they need to flourish. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has followed suit, again, apparently without consulting trans people themselves. This at a time when, paradoxically, both the bishops and many doctors still think intersex children should receive corrective genital surgery without their own consent. This is not epistemological humility, but epistemological presumption. Not just a lack of compassionate curiosity, but a fundamental revulsion to information. It contradicts trans persons' experience of their own finite, particular, complex, ambiguous, and wonderful spirit flesh, and invalidates the insights into sin and structural evil that they gain from their position of social oppression. And it is a factor in high rates of suicide and violent victimization among trans people who do not have adequate support. Deaths that also tear gaping holes in our fabric of interdependence. So, awe before mysterious, divinely created particularity, humble, compassionate curiosity, recognition that present flourishing cannot wait for future justice, and awareness that both life-giving and death-dealing impacts reverberate far beyond individuals to their whole networks. These are 4 consequences of starting ethical reflection with finitude and epistemological humility. Liberationist feminists also sometimes imply that in a perfectly just world, there would be no tragic dilemmas. And I mean this in a really technical sense. A tragic dilemma being a situation in which our moral obligations conflict, and there was no conceivable way to meet one without failing to meet the other. There is an either-or. So do social justice Catholics tend to talk this way. To be sure, as Kate Jackson Meyer notes, social injustice is responsible for a high percentage of our tragic dilemmas. For example, racist systems produced a dilemma for Black Americans: advance justice by registering to vote and risk being murdered, or preserve one's life, on whose livelihood others depend. As Elsie Miranda points out, Roman occupiers created a dilemma for Peter: acknowledge his connection to Jesus and face certain martyrdom, or lie and survive to report the events and continue his work. With 20/20 hindsight, it's not clear that he made the wrong choice. Even Mary, bear the Son of God and risk poverty and scorn, or refuse and preserve her livelihood and family. Given this, I wonder how many women said no before the angel came to Mary. Susan Ross is doing a bit of work in this direction now. What does it mean to refuse? Likewise, many direct decisions about pregnancy come down to a woman's honest judgment that she cannot care for herself, all the people for whom she already cares, and another child with the unjustly inadequate resources at her disposal. The abortion turnaway study, which compared the family outcomes for low-income women who received abortions or were denied them, confirmed this. The women who were refused abortions were less able to support their families financially and less likely to leave abusive partners, and their children did less well developmentally than similar women who received abortions. Society bears most of the blame for creating this dilemma. But genuine dilemmas would arise even in a sinless world. Caring for ourselves and others who rely on us with scarce resources and limited amounts of energy is a fact of finite existence. It produces what Janine Hill Fletcher calls the calculus of concern. The advent of justice would not be the end of earthquakes or hurricanes or forest fires or illnesses of mind and body. Even though without the sin of climate abuse, these disasters might have befallen us less frequently and be less severe, they would still occur, and our finitude would sometimes force tragic decisions. On a smaller scale, there would still be days on which the sum of what others genuinely immediately need comes to more than the amount that we could immediately give, even by activating our networks of support. Particularly with pregnancy, we cannot always put one person's need aside while we meet another. They are both finite. Their needs are urgent, now or never. We must choose. How do we flourish then, when even in a just world, such tragedy is yielded up? Kate Jackson Meyer writes that we must face our grief and regret, not only having failed someone who relies on us, but at even having chosen actively against their flourishing by choosing for another. And these are hard words to hear, I think. We need a new word here because failure implies moral fault, which I don't mean. The abandoned person's suffering is real, not theoretical. Our feelings of pain and loss and regret are real, not superficial. We must hold that harm, pain, and regret together with the knowledge that we are not to blame for the fracture of our overloaded network of interdependence. As Jackson Meyer insists, the only way to manage without becoming callous is to face and lament the harm and our anguish, but in communion with others who help us bear these sorrows and keep our hope alive. Recognition, lament, compassion in community turn out to be essential to flourishing all of the time, not just in situations of oppression. This brings us back to Jesus. We image a Jesus whose human finitude produced his own tragic dilemma: stay here, work signs, and preach, or go home and heal his friend Lazarus, and whose wounded rising confirms the inseparability of his divinity and his humanity, reminding us that even in the best circumstances, flourishing occurs within the bounds of woundedness and mortality. As Michelle Gonzalez says, Jesus Christ is the template for incarnating God's justice and love humanly. What would Jesus, the real Jesus, do? Remembering the bracelets? Anybody? Okay. Is always theologically urgent question. It also brings us back to the Trinity. We could use some bracelets, I think, with the acronym WWTD. What would the Trinity do? Because the Trinity is the communion of love among divine persons who indwell each other, so that we can't think of any without thinking of all, just as we cannot think of a human person without all the people in their network of interdependence who indwell each other, multiplying their joys and dividing their griefs, supporting each other in sorrow and in joy. Maybe in a few minutes, we can discuss this implication, which is perhaps the most important for ethics, and which I have given no space. If, as Catherine Maury Lacugna said, we are essentially relational, not essentially self-contained, isolated, independent individuals, what does this mean for our moral agency? We are agents only with others. Historically, victims of oppression, particularly women, have flourished by imaging the Trinity at all scales, from intimate to political. Still, whether proving our individual worth or enjoying our rising status, privileged U.S. women are tempted to do the opposite, to go it alone. We might imagine that we can image Jesus this way, but we can image the Trinity only by reaching out to accompany others personally and politically. In the process, we realize how many others are accompanying us. Alongside every holy, flourishing, finite woman are more people than we can count. And that's why I'm thinking that my background slide for this lecture is inappropriate, because it has all of these little plants and little trays in their isolated little cells, right? And we need a better image. So lace is one, I think, because the strands of the lace are individually each very weak, and they reach a community identity and support each other and become something extraordinarily strong that will hold together even if you make a hole in it, once they are tatted together in this way. Or, as we're learning, trees and the rhizomes actually share nutrients and perhaps in some way even communicate each other, so that a forest is a completely different thing than a group of trees in pots. So I leave you with these images, perhaps. And now it's your turn to interdepend. As the poet Mary Oliver famously wrote after spending an afternoon watching a single grasshopper, "Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life.
We have some time now for questions and comments from both our in-person audience and our friends joining us via the live stream. If you're joining us on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat or use the Q&A button, and we'll relay them here to Professor Traina. Dr. Julia Fetter and I will run around with these microphones, so if folks have a comment or question for our speaker, please raise your hand and we'll come to you.
I lulled you into complete sleep, I think.
Professor Traina, thank you so much for this brilliant lecture. So I'm thinking a lot about the care work that you're calling us to, and the epistemological humility that that requires. Listening, asking questions of what someone needs. But I guess I kind of want to flip it for just a second. And thinking about those people that need that care work from us and the questions that they ask of us, especially the really difficult question of why. Why did this accident happen? Why am I being oppressed in these ways? How do you think we should respond to that question of why? Or how can we help that individual sit with that why? Or how can we accompany them in that why?
The answer of why a tragedy has occurred is always one of the most difficult. And I think we're all familiar with reading in the paper that when something bad happens, some religious person will go on some talk show and say, well, it's because of the sin of, And so I think that for me, you can see in this talk that I've come from a spirituality of social justice that thinks that if we just line everything up properly, it'll all be good, right? And I've become really strongly affected by what we now know about our climate and our world, realizing that there is no world in which there is no suffering, no death, no disease, no degradation, no extinction. Even if humans weren't here, right? And so for me, this is not maybe helpful to someone who is suffering, but to say simply that it is a mystery. We don't know. I would never say that God has given someone a deformed heart or a missing limb or blindness so that, right? I would only go as far as saying one of our journeys in life is to understand our limits, understand what we need to have supported in them, and figure out how to collaborate creatively within them. Because we all have them, it's just that some are more visible than others. Also, we have to fight for people who are suffering, especially because there are not appropriate social supports for whatever their disability is, right? I remember the world before curb cuts, right? Which most of you probably take for granted now. So,
Professor Traina, I'm intrigued by, I think, what was on your PowerPoint of the theology of disability.
mm-hmm.
That's a new thought for me, and I'm really intrigued by it. and the value that you put on our limitations and our disabilities. And in the midst of all that, I wonder what do you say about the prayer for healing? How do we pray for healing? How do we image healing in the context of what you've said?
That's a really good question. And actually, I couldn't get into the weeds, but disability theologians, I still want to press them a bit on this, because they say, well, there's nothing wrong with getting a prosthetic leg, right? There's nothing wrong with wanting to transcend the bounds of certain of one's limits, right? I will say this simply, and this is also going to be dissatisfying. As a person who has gotten beyond the 6 decades mark, I have learned to pray for healing without knowing exactly what it is that is going to be healed. That may not be helpful, but for me, a prayer for healing is a prayer for what God wants to give me to live within my limits at the moment.
There are many young women in this audience, and I'm so aware of that because I kept thinking as you were going through your marvelous lecture, what kinds of questions does your thinking provoke in them? I think how many of my former students, I'm now retired from here, and they struggled with huge moral dilemmas as they wrote about them in their papers and as they related to the literature they were reading. And these were deeply felt struggles, and sometimes they felt they had no one they could talk with and in the family, to find a family member to speak with, or to find the right person here on campus was so hard. And I kept thinking as I was listening to you tonight, there are dilemmas of the body that I never had to work with as a student here at St. Mary's. There are dilemmas of conscience, some of which I had to work with here as a student. And then there are real struggles with intellect, what's true and what's not true about what I'm hearing in philosophy, theology, ethics, women's studies, my science courses, about what we can know and what we cannot know as women. I don't quite have a question, but I'd love to hear some of your thinking on how young women can survive the world which you have described.
I think I'm not the expert on that. I have 2 daughters, I will say, and they're doing a great job in navigating it. One of the things that I cut out of this, so you've let me say it, right, is that one way is to look for a vocation, but a vocation that is not simply the flowering of the true essence of the self, but a vocation which is walking into what the world is calling you to. And some of us will have, at least professionally, more than one of those, right? I'm not saying that, I've got it and now I have to do this for the rest of my life. For the rest of my life, I will be a bus driver. That's it, right? But we have to be open to where we are called. And that's not only with our professions, but in our personal lives, amid our friends and families. I have been called into places by my family that I did not want to go, that I went kicking and screaming, but it was needed, right? And it was necessary for me to do that, and I needed to become the person I did as a result of it. And so I don't have solutions to moral problems, but what I do have is I hope that everyone can realize you don't have to do everything. And so to be doing one thing at a time in community with others and also in political community, fighting for justice, that, if you can cover those 3 bases in your life, is pretty good. I mean, it's admirable. I was going to put saints in here, and some of them didn't manage all 3, so you'd be outranking them.
You touched briefly on epistemological humanity versus presumption, and so my question is, in today's society, how do you navigate living a humilable life versus living a humble life versus living a life of like presumption, especially when we touch on like really difficult issues that have very polar opposite sides? How do we live a more humble life?
I think that living a humble life takes an amazing amount of courage. Because in our society, I think the reason we don't have humble lives and good conversations is that people are afraid. They're afraid that whatever they have held as true or they feel comfortable with might get blown to bits by actually listening to someone with a very different perspective. And so I don't think I'm really answering your question. Let's see. I think, but to actually invite a person to share their experience and their concerns with you turns out to be a gift to that person that creates a bridge of relationship that you can both walk back and forth across. And then you will have an easier time approaching these difficult questions with them. Right? All of a sudden, it's not something that strikes fear into the two of you, but you realize that you have a connection, and suddenly you have expanded that network of interconnectedness that supports you both. I don't think that's an answer, though. So do you want to ask it again?
Maybe just a better question would be like, how do you stray away from presumption right away when beginning that conversation then?
There was this guy called Gadamer, and there was this guy called Wittgenstein, and they talked a lot about how we never go anywhere without our prejudgments. Because if we haven't organized the world in our brains, we would just be walking around in a pixelated mess, right? So whenever you walk into a situation, you have prejudgments. I think the trick is for us to walk into a situation and expect to be surprised, right? We begin from where we are, but we ask first rather than tell, right? We can't help prejudging. That's why you're in college, because you're so smart at organizing the world conceptually, right? Don't lose that. Don't lose that.
Thank you, Professor Traina. So you talked a lot about finitude, and I was wondering, when we talk about finitude, what does resurrection mean, or what does resurrection look like, or similar question, what does heaven look like?
That's a great question. But I like what Nancy Eislin says about the risen, wounded Jesus. Would we recognize ourselves would anybody recognize us if we got to heaven without all the weird stuff about us? I mean, we would all be, Xerox, that's very old. We would all be printed scans of Brooke Shields at the age of 20. Or else, Selena or whatever, right? Whoever your favorite person is, right? And what does it mean to stop calling wounds and differences imperfections? So for me, it's a question. I don't know what heaven looks like, but I am fascinated by this question of whether we might be able to think of perfection as including everything that we already are. Right? What does it then mean to be perfected in Christ? What does it then mean to be drawn into the communion of saints, right? As ourselves.
Thank you, Dr. Traina. Fantastic sharing with us here tonight. Just wondered if you would comment on your title and the use or your reference to the Book of Wisdom.
That is because I wanted to emphasize, well, first of all, I love the Book of Wisdom. I think that and Sirach are my favorite ways to start the day. But secondly, because to remember that we are all mortal. This is our common quality, which is what makes us so marvelous and amazing and deserving of each other's immediate attention. But that none of us escape that fate. And so I wanted really to put us all on that common plane, but also as dependent on God.
Up a question looking back to your ethical issues when you brought up trans and intersex individuals.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a course, St. Mary's, first time offered queer theology, and it's one of my favorites that I've taken here. And we just want to discuss if you have any suggestions on how to encourage students who aren't particularly drawn to these types of classes to participate in such, because as a Catholic institution, we are surrounded by people who are not as open-minded as myself, even though I identify as Catholic, through the examples I've had in my life, right? I want to just, I guess, like, invite everyone who doesn't see queer theology as, like, strange, but is actually just interested in making this campus more inclusive, and then further on in their life as they move on away from college.
Well, it always helps when a student meets someone that belongs to the identity that makes them uncomfortable, because that usually helps a lot. But the thing I want to say about queer theology is that there is absolutely nothing more traditional and absolutely nothing more Catholic than queer theology in this sense. The idea that we need to have strict definitions and separations and boundaries between everything is a very modern idea. Catholic theology uses metaphor, uses analogy, uses allegory, uses simile, there are no equal signs in Catholic theology, right? Until you get to the modern era, really. And so the way that queer theology proceeds is actually taking us back to the richness of our poetic and our aesthetic and what do I want to say? Mystical roots in theology. And to read queer theology is to go back to that, right? And so one thing that can help is to point out to people who think that they are uninterested in this or don't believe in it, what is queerer than the Trinity or Jesus, right? I mean, come on. So just talk to them about the Trinity and Jesus. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, and it's going to go to one of our students here. No pressure, Francesca.
This is kind of taking off into a little bit of a different course and conversation. What really stood out to me in your presentation was the idea of mutual interdependence and reliance in community, which seen in the Trinity. And I wanted to know what we can do when someone doesn't want to be a part of this community. When they may say, I'm unworthy of your love, or I'm unworthy of God's love. How do we navigate these types of conversations while respecting this person's limits?
I think, yeah, to be with someone when they're lamenting and not cut them off is absolutely essential. Okay? One of the things that we can do is gradually ask them what is the because or the reason for the lament, right? But it's also the case that nobody ever made a theological argument that got someone out of that spot. So interdependence is not all about talking. It's about being, right? And doing and sitting, right? With the person. So this kind of a conversion is not something that you can argue someone into. In fact, you're never going to argue someone into an alteration of their theology, right? You're going to accompany them and into an alteration of their theology. You're going to comfort them into an alteration of their theology. You're going to challenge them in exciting ways into an alteration of their theology, but you can't argue them into it, right? Nothing you can say. You can't just say, no, you're not, right? Doesn't work. So I think you know that, though. It has been such an honor to be with you. Thank you so much.
My first order of business before we go was to invite you to join me in thanking Professor Traina for an extraordinary lecture. So let's continue the applause. Just 3 short things. First, before you go this evening, we invite you to join us in the atrium just outside the auditorium here for a light dessert and coffee reception where you can continue this conversation. It looked like there were more questions and comments. Professor Traina will be in the hallway, as I hope many of you will as well. There are very good snacks out there. Second, across the hall from these delicious snacks, I hope I'm not building the expectations too high, is a table displaying samples of previously published Madeleva Lectures. And I hope I'm not embarrassing her, but I want to acknowledge you heard her name given as a shout out in Professor Traina's talk, but we are joined this evening as well by one of our previous Madeleva Lectures, Dr. Susan Ross of Loyola University Chicago. I believe a copy of her lecture, published lecture, is on that table as well. So we invite you to peruse those. They're just sample copies. You can visit Paulus Press or wherever you get fine books to order your copies. And then finally, now that we're reconvening in person post the pandemic, we're restoring a tradition that used to take place in the in-person lectures, which is to announce next year's Madeleva Lecture. Ooh, people got quiet. It is indeed a great pleasure and a humbling honor to announce that the 2024 Madeleva Lecture will be delivered next year by Dr. Natalia Imperatori Lee, professor and chair of the Department of Religious Studies at Manhattan College in New York. Mark your calendars. Next year's Madeleva Lecture will take place here, same bat time, same bat channel. That's an old reference. On Thursday, April 11th in 2024. We really hope to see you all here in person, and for those who can't be, to join us virtually. Have a great evening and enjoy the reception in the atrium.